Episode 2, Iron, Sharp Things and Blunderbusses. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the way iron and steel axes, froes, wedges, saws, knives, swords, sharp things, and clunky black powder firearms like blunderbusses and fowling pieces influenced the way food was acquired and prepared in the 17th century British Atlantic that was to become America, and how some of those early choices and actions still echo in the way we get and prepare our food now. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. One of the odder realizations I had while nailing down how I wanted to tackle the history of American food was that the earliest colonists of what was to become the United States of America were not farmers, or were not good farmers. And to survive, they needed to be good farmers and foragers, or die. And death was the more common fate of the first arrivals in both Plymouth and Jamestown. Indeed, many of the first colonists were soldiers and adventurers. In the 17th century, adventurer often meant a speculating investor. And these are both professions where you buy food, or food just appears, thanks quartermaster, or you might resort to other means to get your food. But in neither case do they work the land, squint at the clouds, watch their crops, harvest and process them, and start making plans for next year. And it is with this somewhat modernish and urban-ish mindset of buying food that both the Jamestown and Plymouth colonies were launched. Yeah, they would need food, and they would grow some, but they would get the rest somewhere? So how did all these sharp things and firearms connect with these early, decidedly not farmer people to food? By the way, for many of the objects I talk about, sharp and explodey, I'll provide pictures or links to examples in the show notes at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Some will look familiar and some are downright odd. Many of the sharp things both Plymouth and Jamestown colonists brought were to be used on wood. Returning to the Reverend Mr. Higginson's list of iron things a well-set-up colonist should bring, the woodworking tools on his list were 1 broadaxe, 1 felling axe, 1 steel handsaw, 1 gimblet or gimblet, I'm not sure which way to pronounce that, but it's an auger used to create peg holes when nails are scarce, 1 whipsaw, 1 hatchet, 1 hammer, 2 froes, and this is a blade wedge used for splitting logs to make clapboards, 1 auger, 4 chisels, and nails of all sorts. I will add in a shingle or draw knife as something that would have been both common and handy. Many of these things were used for creating the homes and wooden equipment the settlers needed, but they were also important for producing export stuff to be traded for commodity foods. Part of the plan for getting enough food, especially the peas, grains, and biscuit, just to have enough energy to work to survive, was to get those things shipped in from England. Some of the first recorded shipments back from the colonies were clapboard, which is super old school siding, shingles, and wood tar and wood pitch, and 4 tall trees for ship masts. All of these were sold to pay off investors and buy food to ship back. The, quote, wood products for food, unquote, gig did not work out well. Neither Plymouth nor Jamestown were ever able to make it into the black just by solely using wood products. And the return food was never enough. The supply trips back with the food were less frequent than the colonies had planned for, partly due to crummy weather and partly due to the captains getting off track to go do a little piracy. Cargo journeys just did not pay enough, which meant that some of the cargo got eaten up, and the amount of money earned was just never that good. The wood products cargoes were both paying off investors and buying more food, and it just never worked out. The plan from the beginning for both groups had been to get some food or buy some food somewhere or somehow. At no point were either of these early English colonies planning to grow, forage, and hunt for everything they ate. This norm of importing some food from back home or elsewhere, regardless of the clear fertility of the land, was in place from the very start. As far as how much food to import and how much food to grow, it just feels like no one really sat down and did the math. They just figured it would work out somehow. More specifically, they almost always went with some version of "with God's help." But that was as specific as it got. Now, this is not a criticism, but a framing of a very common attitude of the 17th century. So much of what we take for granted currently was beyond the control of most or all people. In Europe, there weren't steady water supplies. All food was seasonal, and the amounts were highly variable depending on the weather. Heck, road conditions, room temperature, and travel times, things we think of as pretty dependable, were largely determined by nature. Just as an example, a crossing of the English Channel, about 21 miles, could take sailing vessels in the 17th century somewhere between 8 hours and several weeks. It was really hard to plan. Pain relief was limited, and an enormous number of infections, things that we would look at and think, oh, clean that out, put on a little ointment, slap a bandage on it, could result in amputation or death. I mean, for firsties, there might not even be soap, much less the ointment and bandage. So taking let's just try something because things as they are, where I am, are pretty rotten. So with God's help, and that attitude was not out of the ordinary. In fact, it was very, very common and the way most people faced daily life. Okay, so lots of sharp iron things were used to make wood things for local use and export. Along with stuff like shelter and buckets, those axes and hatchets would definitely have been used to cut firewood. And unlike in Europe, there was lots of unregulated wood. At times what felt like too much wood. Unlike back in 17th century Europe, these colonies had no worries about firewood. The next set of sharp iron things to consider were the knives. The food knives that colonists brought were generally pretty good to even very good knives, but every last one of them was primarily a slicing knife. The profession of butcher in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, made really limited use of bone cutting, all the way up through the late 18th century. Once animals were broken down into sizes a single person could move around, most of the cutting up of animals, great and small, was done by cutting at the joints. And this way of approaching animals came with the colonists. There was certainly the practice of cracking bones to get at marrow, but this was something done more often in times of want, or ironically, to show off a dish that required work and finesse, say a marrow pie, a pudding, or pasty, and steadily became less common over time. Birds were served either cut apart at the joints or whole, but never cut across the bone. This shows up even in our modern American food language. We speak of a joint of beef, a leg of lamb, and we specify particularly bone-in or boneless. Bones were, from the beginning of European arrival in America to be, seen as something primarily to be separated from food at the table. Bones were used, don't get me wrong, but they mainly stayed in the kitchen. They were typically used to make something called strong broth. We'd think of that as stock or bone broth now. But over time, bones, and especially cow bones, started to leave the stew pot and find their way to other uses, and we'll see them again later. Certainly, lower leg bones and calves' feet would always be prized for their gelatin. But the knife preferences and the class awareness that the colonists brought with them have stuck with us. Except for the chicken leg, Americans have increasingly pushed bones off the table. In fact, because bones were seen as scraps pretty much right from the start, something to be used elsewhere, bones and the bony animal parts in general have fallen off the typical American menu and largely disappeared from the American kitchen. I know somebody's going to say, but ribs, and I'm going to say, A, those come later, and B, the McRib is a boneless thing with meat molded into the shape of a bone. I stand by my statement. But back to the knives and class awareness. The fact that colonists arrived with the idea of cutting up animals into parts to cook them, in pots, remember, meant that there was a tendency to cook animals for smaller family groups rather than as a community act. In fact, even in the early days of both Jamestown and Plymouth, with men outnumbering the women sometimes as much as 10-1, and survival uncertain, these communities were steadfast in their dedication to the family structure rather than even a temporary community structure. Women who found themselves pressed into food prep and preservation tasks for men unrelated to them were resentful enough to have their complaints recorded, and women's words were rarely recorded in 17th century writing. The unattached men felt no particular obligation to provide extra services to these women, such as carrying water, providing extra firewood, maintenance or repairs to kitchen structures or equipment, so the practice of cutting up larger animals into family-sized portions was part of the original structure, and they stuck to it. And when you are parting an animal and doling out pieces to this family and that family, inevitably some groups are going to get tastier, meatier bits, and others are going to get bonier, tougher, scraggier bits. From the start, a class structure of who got what and dividing large animals before cooking and making community meals a rare rather than a common thing was part of the landscape. Class and access to food that was considered good or poor was baked into the structure of society right from the start. Now, not all knives that the colonists brought were for their own use. Some knives were specifically brought as trade items. Colonists knew that there was a population of Indians or salvages or savages that were living on some sort of grain. Okay, at this point, people were figuring out that they weren't traveling to China or India when they sailed west on the Atlantic. But the Europeans never spent much time thinking about who the people already living in the New World were. So they most often went with savages, and then later Indian became more common. Thus, the colonists were planning on using knives and some other objects to trade for that grain. So just how overawed were the local tribes that met the Jamestown and Plymouth colonists once they got these knives? Archaeological evidence has been found which shows that objects originating in South America did meander their way up as far as Florida. And it is clear from the adventures of certain individuals, who we will get to soon, that there were connected routes for travel and information along the East Coast from Newfoundland to Florida. The coastal tribes had a pretty impressive communication network all the way up and down the coast, and then trade networks that reached into South America. What this all means, in terms of the colonists, they were not as much of a surprise to the local native peoples as I was led to believe in my K-12 history classes. Yes, those giant floating islands of ships were baffling wonderments. But any tribe on the East Coast already knew that they contained pale-skinned, hairy-faced men on them, and they had some pretty sweet knives and other weapons. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and their agents had been making boot prints all over the place, from the Chesapeake to Brazil, and the Basque and then later French and English fishing fleets had been drying cod on the shores of Newfoundland all the way down to Maine since at least the 15th century. And they had been showing off their axes, knives, cutlasses, and the occasional hand cannon, or blunderbuss. Oh, and sail repair needles. Those were certainly also noticed. So unlike the, oh, wow, we are so overwhelmed and amazed, have some venison, berries, and corn narrative I got as a kid, better scholarship shows that the reaction of a local tribe or confederation to the arrival of a ship full of clanking Europeans often had much to do with whether a given tribe was comfortably holding power or seeking ways to get more power. Native American societies had deep appreciation for edged objects, whether they be tools or weapons. There was no iron culture in the Americas, but the sophisticated stone knapping culture meant that the use of and appreciation for the cutting edge was well developed. Anyone who regularly makes and uses a stone axe knife, spear point, or arrowhead can clearly see the point, of an iron axe, adze, knife, and cutlass, and they would be extremely useful. So if a member of a tribal confederation was in search of an ally to boost their position, these new guys who arrived with those sweet knives might just be worth cultivating or rapidly attacking. But a village, tribe, or confederation that is comfortable in their power position, maybe they'll just send out some warriors to taunt and moon a passing ship and otherwise stay away. Yes, that really happened. Some gestures simply translate effectively across time and space. And what happened with the Powhatans in Jamestown and the Wampanoag conflicts around Plymouth lends weight to this view. Individuals, tribes, and confederations looking to shift a power dynamic were more likely to cultivate or actively attack arriving Europeans. That's right, it wasn't all about us Proto-Americans. The tribes each had their own political things going on, and the Europeans were sometimes just useful props. And so those trade knives that were brought to trade for food, corn especially, sometimes did do just that. But they could also lead to problems. Not long after the introduction of trade knives, there would be repeated conflict when non-trade objects, especially axes and hatchets, were either asked for or simply taken. And this taking wasn't only one way. Repeatedly, colonial crops failed. Sometimes it was due to poor planting practices, or, especially in Jamestown, there were a bunch of guys who just wanted to be hunting for gold. They didn't want to make wood planks, and they didn't want to do farming, so they didn't. And now you have a bunch of soldiers and adventurers who, well, yeah, it was not unfamiliar territory for a soldier to just, requisition, liberate foodstuffs grown, gathered, and processed by others. Well, the native populations were about as other as it got. So yes, food would be taken, and this repeatedly led to conflicts where the swords and firearms came into play. At the start, colonists in both settlements brought plenty of swords and their black powder pieces. The swords were likely a mixture of thin stabbing swords, the kind with a basket hilt, like Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride, like that, but not as fancy. Or a heavier single-edged sword, like a backsword or a falchion, things that look more like a pirate cutlass or a machete. Initially, the colonists thought the firearms would give them the most advantage, but it is important to remember that 17th century firearms would mainly be matchlock type. That means there was a slow match or fuse that had to be lit and used to fire the powder. A musketeer had to walk around with some sort of fire or smoldering match. Very, very not useful in the rain and very tricky for sneaking up on deer. Further, these shot big, heavy lead balls, and not very far, and with dismal accuracy. So they worked best when shot at a, say, big flock of birds, hence fowling pieces. And for what I mean by big, I found a cool video of a massive flock of starlings in Denmark I've linked to in the show notes. Bird flocks like this, or even much larger ones, and we'll get to you, passenger pigeon, used to be a reasonably common thing in the U.S. So you could see why if someone randomly shot a clunky short-range hand cannon in the general direction of an enormous bird flock dimming the sun, they would probably hit something. The use of these pieces is also why the early colonists more often traded with the local tribes for venison rather than being successful at downing it themselves. bow and arrow and spear technology were both much better for hunting deer than blunderbusses. But the practical usefulness of 17th century black powder weapons aside, they did play important ceremonial roles. They were displayed and showed off with during celebrations and were used in parades for both European and Native American dignitaries as a display of respect and or power. Again, as a culture that had an active warrior element to its leadership and organization, the different confederations of coastal tribes had interest in and respect for these loud, explodey items that wounded in a novel way. As a result, these 17th century colonists obtained food from local tribes in a variety of ways using their swords and firearms. 1. By projecting an image of a militarily substantial presence that local leaders, tribes, or factions felt was worth cultivating by using food gifts or trading for food. 2. By coercing local tribes to provide food or just outright raiding or stealing it. And 3. The least productive, by shooting game. After digging through primary sources, the reams of writing that came from both early colonial arrivals, there are clear themes as to how iron played a role in food acquisition. They all share a distinct way of seeing the world. There were assumptions about food, what even counted as food, and how to obtain it. There was the assumption that iron would be present in a multiplicity of forms. And this assumed access to iron, as both tools and weapons, shaped the attitudes and actions of the 17th century people who lived through these times. Next week, I'll be moving on to the last section of iron, chains. This means looking at the different ways America solved its muscle power problems, including how they talked themselves into it and how early seeds planted back then are still part of our American food landscape now. After that, I will finally get to the first edible thing, sugar, and how 17th century sugar is such a large part of how America even happened. Realizing that European commercial sugar production comes before America is part of what motivated me to dive into this podcast. So I hope you will join me next week for some surprising history, including the start of the strange adventures of that deus ex machina that is Squanto. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Again, thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting books I read for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio, THOA Food, and in the show description.